it's just social stuff. Like I said, there's a happy hour in the department tonight, and I'm going over to Miguel and Sarah's for dinner tomorrow night, I think, and apart from that, yeah, packing my bags.
Probably it's gone really fast.
The whole trip has really. The other day I was like, God, it's 3 months exactly since I'd left New Zealand, and I was like, what have I done, sort of. Yeah.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone to a special session of our transportation seminar. My name is Lynn Wigand and I'm the Director of the Initiative for Bicycle and Pedestrian Innovation here at Portland State. And IBPI, along with OTREC, the Oregon Transportation Research and Education Consortium, are pleased to present this seminar. Dr. Glen Koorey from New Zealand has been here for about 3 weeks as part of his 3-month sabbatical. And he's going to share a little bit more about attracting the next 10% of cyclists and some of their experience in New Zealand. So I'll just let you tell them a little bit more about yourself and launch right into it.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Lynn, and thank you very much, IBPI, for this opportunity here. Yes, I teach at Canterbury University in New Zealand, in Christchurch. We'll talk a bit more about Christchurch in a minute. I teach in the Civil Engineering Department. What I'm going to talk about today is some research with a couple of my colleagues from the Geography Department, really looking at how we can try and attract a bit more cycling in New Zealand, and I think there's certainly some applicability to what I've seen here in Portland as well. Just to introduce my 2 other co-researchers on this work, so there is Simon and Catherine, and also one of our clients as well. That was last year at Velocity in Brussels. That's in the European Parliament. That was when we released some of our preliminary findings as well. So I certainly want to acknowledge their contributions to this work. Okay, what I want to do this afternoon, firstly just set a bit of context about New Zealand and Christchurch in terms of cycling in particular. Talk about what our aims for the research were, and then go through the methods we use, which basically boiled down to some wide-ranging questionnaires and some more targeted focus groups, and part of that was looking at infrastructure options, and I'll show some of the different options that we tested, and then wrap up with some findings and conclusions from there. Okay, I think a lot of people sort of, when they hear New Zealand, especially after the Lord of the Rings movies, this is what they see, and they think, sounds like a great place, fantastic place to go and bike. And there's certainly a lot of places like this, nice scenery, hardly anyone around, fantastic place to bike. Probably helped even more now that our Prime Minister, since last year, he's actually started up a New Zealand cycle trail project to actually develop a network of cycle rides around the country, ultimately to link them up. We've got $50 million in there to start things off. And I guess we're looking at perhaps something like the Sustrans model in the UK, if you're familiar with that, ultimately getting a very good network coming through there. One of the problems I have at the moment is that this is very tourism focused, and it's not really reaching into the towns where most of us actually live. So while this is a nice image here, the reality for most of us in New Zealand is actually something a bit more like this. Okay, this is my hometown in Christchurch. We drive on the opposite side of the road, in case you hadn't picked up. And of course, it's very similar to a lot of things that you would see here in North America as well. So yes, there are cycle facilities. There's a cycle lane hiding over there, but not a nice environment when you've got 6 lanes of through traffic coming through there. Okay, so a bit more about New Zealand. It's actually very similar to Oregon in a lot of respects. We have about the same number of people. We're actually about the same size. We're actually slightly bigger, I learnt the other day. And that population is very much focused in the urban area. So it's a low population density. What people there are tend to be in the main centres around. Similar climates as well. I think we're as far, or certainly the South Island is as far south of the equator as Oregon is north of the equator as well. And really we've looked to a lot of other Western countries, particularly the Anglo-centric ones, so Australia, North America, the UK, for our historical transportation development. So not surprising, there's been a lot of focus on automobile transportation in the past, and really until about the last decade there hasn't been a lot of focus on the alternatives, including bicycling. So our capital is Wellington there in the middle. Our biggest city is Auckland, about 1.2 million people, and we're down there in Christchurch, the second biggest city in the South Island there. Now this is the story we've seen in the last couple of decades, is that lack of investment in cycling has really seen a massive decline. So this is our data from the census from the last 2 decades. And you can see effectively a halving of our cycle usage. This is for the trip to work from our 5-yearly census data. And it really shows you what we have had, so the relative peak of the 80s in recent history anyway, to what we've got to now just because we weren't really providing for it. So it'll be interesting to see whether some of the more recent initiatives are helping arrest that decline when we do the next census in 2011. We've also had for the last few years, a New Zealand travel survey, which is looking at the broader range of trips. And here at the moment we're sitting at not quite 2%, about 1.8% of all our trips are by bicycle in New Zealand. So this is capturing also trips to school, trips to shops, for leisure and so forth. And so that's proving to be a very useful data set as well as we try and understand the patterns going on in New Zealand. So this is a bit of a concern. What do we do about this? Okay, we've seen this decline in the last 20 odd years, and as you saw from the pictures, the urban environment is not really a nice one for a lot of cycling. You're invariably having to share with motorised traffic or maybe pedestrian traffic. And I guess what we were trying to work out was how do we get some of those people back to cycling or starting up cycling. So what did it take to actually encourage them a bit more in New Zealand? Now, in the last couple of weeks, looking around Portland and hearing some presentations, I quite like this concept here from the Portland Bike Plan, which sort of splits out the types of cyclists. And I guess historically here, and certainly I think we find the same in New Zealand, we've provided for the enthused and confident on top of the strong and fearless who are going to ride anyway. But I guess, the challenge is that next lot, the interested but concerned. Potentially a big market. They're amenable to the thought of cycling, but, they're just not so comfortable about some of the existing conditions out there. And so I'm interested to see how you're looking to tackle it, and I guess we're trying to come up with the same issues as well. So the aims of this research really was to look at those new cyclists. What type of infrastructure is going to attract those new cyclists? Okay, new in terms of new to utility cycling. They may actually be, say, recreational cyclists, but for regular trips to work, the shops, school and so forth, they're not in the habit of biking there. Okay, and so what we wanted to do was present various examples from both New Zealand and overseas of different types of facilities and see which ones sparked their interest and I guess their potential support for if they were going to ride as well. We also had a sort of broader aim of investigating in general the barriers and motivations for cycling, and this was really because we wanted to check first, was it actually infrastructure that was the main thing that was stopping them? I mean, was it actually other practical or logistical issues that actually were the first thing that was stopping them? So we wanted to sort of check that first before we focused too much on the specifics of different types of infrastructure. This research was funded by our New Zealand Transport Agency over the last couple of years. We're just wrapping it up at the moment. I actually just sent off last week the research report with a few reviews and edits to my co-researchers and onto our peer reviewers, so that hopefully we should get the final report published fairly soon. But I can certainly supply some previous conference papers if anyone's interested. Okay, so we focused on Christchurch and the people in Christchurch and what we could do there. It's a mid-sized city, 330,000 within the city itself, not too much in the greater area beyond that. It traditionally has been New Zealand's cycling city, the cycling capital, at least for New Zealand anyway. And it's really because of the potential for the cycling there. Okay, it has a very flat topography, which has been a shock to the system for me riding around Portland in the last few weeks and encountering a few hills. It has a very good climate. It's very dry in that part of the country, and the range of temperatures is not too cold, not too hot at the extremes as well. So it's made for that. It has wide streets, perhaps not so good from a speed perspective, but it certainly means that there's a lot of room to potentially do things on those street corridors. And we've made a reasonable effort over the past 2 decades to provide some cycle provision, both on-road and off-road. There's about 80 miles of facilities around the city at the moment. And yet, despite all this, we've seen this decline that we've seen nationally as well. From a slightly higher base, we had about 11% in '86, and that's gone down to about 6 or 7% in 2006 there. And I had to say most of that drop actually has been in the past, in the first decade. The last decade, I think we have actually started to hold steady, so that is reflecting some of that investment in cycling facilities there. And for transport, again, a lower overall proportion, about 3% of the trips there. Okay, so similar numbers, I guess, to what we're seeing in Portland here at about 7 or 8%, I think, overall, if I recall. Just to show you a range of what we have, there's a lot of streets, of course, that have no cycle facilities of any kind, and some of them may be fine if they're a quiet street, but a lot of them are, busy shopping streets, arterial roads, not much fun to bike on there. We like our roundabouts in New Zealand, so there's certainly a few of those. They're not so bad when they're like that. They're not so good when they're big multi-lane roundabouts. We have a range of facilities, as I say, on-road and off-road. So here's some examples of on-road cycle lanes and using a bit of colour in some locations. And also a mixture of path facilities as well. Some are really just glorified sidewalks, as you can see. Some there's a bit more to it. This one's along the river. That's actually my kids riding along the river there. So we have a real mix of facilities going on. Most of those, as you can see, though, they're shared. They're either shared pedestrian cycle facilities or they're shared with the traffic, or at least you're on the road with the traffic there. We only have a couple of dedicated facilities so far specifically for cyclists. One was an experiment done about 7 years ago, and it was one-way cycle tracks either side of the street. So you have the sidewalk, you have the cycle track, and then the street there. And there was a few interesting technical issues about that. It's worked reasonably well, but there'd certainly be a few tweaks I'd make if we were doing it again. More recently, we've tried a two-way track, and this is where a street got reconstructed. It got narrowed down, a cycle track put onto the side there. And that kind of makes sense because of the desire lines at each end link with this nice directly, so you're not actually having to cross the road to get to the path. You tend to be already on the side that you want to. Very popular link between two of our bigger high schools and the university and our major railway cycleway along that one there. So we're starting to experiment with some of these things, and I guess this is why we want to know, what should we do next? Do these work? Do we need to try something else? And this is where the research could hopefully help. Okay, so the first thing we did was have a series of wide-ranging questionnaires, and we had three main target audiences that we could tap into. At the university itself, we have a regular travel survey done about every 4 years, just trying to understand travel patterns in general, and then we ask various sort of qualitative questions about also why you do it or what would make you change and so forth. So we had a very good set of data from 2008, over 4,000 responses there from staff and students, so that was a good database that we could pick through the results from that. We also then focused on recreational cyclists, and we did this two ways. Firstly, we intercepted some of them. We went to some of the popular mountain biking areas or cafes where the road races hang out and so forth, and just interviewed some of them there. And we also had an online questionnaire that we made known around the popular websites for them as well. And we got about 370 responses that way there. The last thing we did was also try and focus a bit more on community cycling, and so we tried to target through various community newsletters people who might be interested in cycling, not just for work, but maybe also to the library or the shops or things like that as well. So we just had an online questionnaire for that. It was a bit harder to get, I guess, some response for this one here, but we got another 120 respondents from this. So this was our initial sort of set of data that we could sort of look at some general patterns, and then from this we asked each of these groups, were they interested in following up and perhaps being involved in more detailed focus groups, and so we were able to get another set from this who we could sort of ask a bit more about things. So the focus groups, they tended to be at any time 3 to 6 people. All up we got 48 participants from that wider group, not as much as we would have liked, but still an amazingly rich set of responses we got out of that group, certainly in the qualitative data there, and a reasonable numerical set, as we'll see later there. What we did is we started general and then I guess focused in. So we'd start about their transport choices at the moment, why they did them, why didn't they choose other modes, and then focused about some of the issues about cycling, what did they like or not like about cycling as a mode. And then we showed them a series of different types of cycle facilities, and we posed the question to them as they were looking through these: if this was the way for you to go to work or shops or wherever the place is, would you be likely to cycle that route if this was a type of facility that you were typically finding on the way? And we had a 4-scale rating there, from pretty much frequently to never cycle using that facility there as we went through. And so they'd rate them. We'd have a bit of discussion as well so we could get some qualitative feedback out of these things. So I'm going to show some examples of the different types of facilities and how we did it. So one of the methods we used was to use some aerial plans. And so just to give you a bit of a guidance of what we had there, there's our little cyclists there looking like little Mexicans with hats, I suppose. We'd have cycle paths were marked like this. We would have parked traffic, we'd have moving traffic, we might have on-road cycle lanes, some with colour, some without, and we might have footpaths or sidewalks as well. So depending on the configuration, we'd just sort of rearrange the plan and show them the intended layout from there. As well as that, we'd show them a variety of photos of the possible examples of the particular facility as well. So here's an example for no specific cycling provision. So here's just an ordinary street, nothing special done for the bikes. And we'd show some typical photos saying this is the kind of street that you might get. And we tried to match up the amount of traffic on all the photos. Not all of the photos we had the same amount of traffic, so that could bias things. So we'd sort of Photoshop in the extra car or two to sort of give them all a moderate amount of traffic. And you know, if you look too closely, you can sort of see the lines. But you know, I think most people got the gist and got the feel of the environment that way there. So we'd show them the plan. What we also did was show them a mock-up for the mid-block ones of the same street with the different types of situations. Now, we chose a street in Auckland, so there wasn't any sort of emotional attachment to that particular street, well, hopefully. And you can see in particular we tried to choose a location that had some of the elements that we wanted them to think about. So not just the mid-block, but the fact that you've got driveways, you've got parked vehicles, you've got minor side roads as well. All those things, how might they affect your choice of different facilities? Okay, so this is the street with nothing. You've just got to fend for yourself on the street. We'd show a few more examples, and some of you may recognise actually Portland from my last visit here actually, with a couple more photoshopped cars in there as well. Okay, and then we just walk through the different options. So for example, if we have a marked cycle lane, so now we show them the plan, an example of that there. Back to the mock-up, and we'd show them what that might look like on that same street. I had lots of fun photoshopping all these things. And a few more photo examples as well, just so they could get a feel of the different options and how it might look, and then they could do their rating accordingly. Okay. And we just worked our way through the scale of options. Now, we actually mixed them up in terms of the order, so there wasn't an obvious, if you like, bias in the order. We'd randomly, for each group, give them a different ordering of these things, but I'm just going to show them in the sort of I guess, logical order of separation here. We could add a bit of extra highlighting, make the lines a bit thicker, add a bit more colour, so that was another option. Now, it's a little hard to see perhaps, but we could now put a curb in between the traffic lane and the bike lane as well, with the parking still behind. So we have a curb running along here, providing a bit more of a physical separation between the bikes and the cars. We could switch that over, so now the bikes are behind the parked cars, immediately behind the parked cars. We could add a bit of separation so that the car door doesn't collect you as you're biking past, for example. And finally, for this set, we could just sort of take the sidewalk area and provide a shared ped bike area along there. Okay, so that was the different options we provided for mid-block situations, and we got them to rate them. We then looked at also traffic signal intersections, and we looked at two particular manoeuvres. The first one was if you were just biking through. So again, we had everything from nothing provided at all, bike lanes. A couple of examples I just want to show here. This was providing a bike path, and in this first case here, you just went with the general traffic signal. So when the light was green for the traffic, you also got to go across as well. Actually, hang on, let's just see. Oh, I flipped over the pictures, my mistake. That's the one you want. So you have this type of scenario here, which doesn't, of course, always work when there's turning traffic in your way. Okay, and then we also provided the option of if there's a dedicated cycle, maybe pedestrian signal as well. So all the other traffic is stopped, or the conflicting traffic anyway. You get to cross over safely, and that's this type of situation here from Europe, for example. We have a dedicated facility. So we were trying to give them different variations on how it might work to get across the intersection. Then we also looked at the right turn manoeuvre, which we know is quite a trickier beast when it comes to signals. And so again, we had a range of everything from nothing, variations on lanes. This one you're starting to see a bit more here in Portland. So this is what we call the advanced stop box, or the bike box, allowing you to get over and then turn right, your left, in that situation there. So there's some examples, one from home, and I think that might be in Victoria actually, I think that one. Another one we introduced was the hook turn concept as well, which we're starting to see a few of those here on Broadway, for example. So this is where you do it in a two-step manoeuvre. You come along here, go to a safe space, wait for the lights to change, and then come across there on the next phase. Okay, and we've got a couple of examples homegrown like this, and also showed some overseas examples. There's a few variations, of course, on how you could mark these things. Another one we introduced was what we call a head start signal. So this is where the rest of the traffic is stopped. you push a button and you get to go before the rest of the traffic. You get your own little phase to go separate from the traffic as well. And we have one of these in one of our cities, Palmerston North, an intermediate school, a middle school, a lot of right-turning demand, so you're talking about 11, 12-year-old children, not too confident across this busy street here, so they get to push what looks like a bit of a pedestrian button and call a separate phase to go across the traffic like that. Okay, the final thing we looked at was roundabouts, and we focused on single-lane roundabouts. We know there's a lot of particular issues with multi-lane roundabouts, so we tried to steer away from that in this discussion anyway, and look at single-lane roundabouts in theory designed to get speeds down and so forth. And then we looked at options, again, from do-nothing, variations on cycle lanes within the road, and this is an interesting variation here where you've sort of got separated cycle lanes here, and this is really so that you can split out the traffic that's exiting, the cyclists that are exiting, from the cyclists that are circulating, and the motorists actually know the intentions well ahead of having to potentially conflict that area. And this one's actually being done in York in the UK. So this is an example from the city of York where they've done this marking and spiralling out at each of the exits like that. It looks quite convoluted from on the plan, but on the ground level it's a little more easy to follow the markings as you go around. And we also did a variety of off-road options for roundabouts as well, so pathways around the side with or without priority. In this case, cyclists have crossing priority, so the motorists have to stop. And we also did underpass options as well, so you can completely bypass any traffic situations like that. Here's an example of the cyclist priority from the Netherlands, and so you can see the stop bars, or stop triangles in this case, for the traffic as they approach the cycle crossing points in that location. Okay, so on to some findings from this. Firstly, a couple of the key questions from the questionnaire. Firstly, we asked people actually if they felt that the distance was an okay distance for them to cycle. And in general, you can see we had a fairly positive response. And most people felt within Christchurch that yep, it wasn't too far to cycle to work from their destination or cycle to school from their destination. Now, this was particularly evident in the community survey, and I guess that perhaps reflects the self-selection of that group, that they were all online respondents. The recreational survey, not quite as much because it was a mixture of intercepting people and also self-selection. And the university travel survey was the entire university population, so you'd expect it to be a lot closer to perhaps the normal population there. Interesting thing that came up, particularly with the recreational group, often the assumption when you're asking this question is it not too far for you to cycle? Okay, you don't live 15 miles away and that's just too far to bike. We had quite a number of people, though, who say were quite regular recreational riders, road riders and so forth, and they actually said the opposite. They said, it's too short. It's only 2 miles to my work. That's not a ride. You know, I won't get a workout from that. It's just not worth the effort of actually riding. And that was kind of interesting. We hadn't sort of expected that response. You can sort of see potential ways around that. You know, okay, ride the long way to work, but I guess some people were perhaps factoring in, well, perhaps they didn't have the time to fit that in, say, on their way to work at least. So anyway, it was quite a common enough response that came out for a number of them that said, it just is not a long enough ride to make it worth my while to get some exercise. So they were clearly focusing on the ride as providing them with some exercise, not just from getting from A to B as well. So something to factor into the mix that we hadn't sort of come across before. Okay, we asked what would encourage you to cycle, or if you already cycled, to cycle some more, and we checked a variety of responses. I guess the first one to check out is the bottom one here, what wouldn't make you cycle at all. Not surprisingly, that university travel survey, which has that much more general population, it was a reasonable population, just like the Portland Bike Plan. That's that no way, no how group, if you like. 30% there saying, I can't see myself biking at all. Okay. If you look at the other ones that pop up, a lot of it relates to the road environment. So key ones, for example, more courteous road drivers, less traffic on the roads, and improved cycle routes. So having good physical infrastructure of some kind, or cycle provision of some kind, and also having drivers that respect that provision as well, or not having those drivers there as all. That came through quite a bit. Okay. Some of the other ones, which especially cropped up for the university travel survey, was things like just actually living closer to where they were going to school or work. Also the weather, despite what I said before, people still felt, you know, if the weather was too cold, too wet, You can never satisfy some people with the weather, it seems, no matter where you go. Okay, in the general discussion that sort of looked at transport options and what they liked and didn't like, it came through in a variety of ways really with safety. Okay, when you sort of dug into the concerns, safety kept coming up, and when you looked into what that actually meant, it tended to boil down to the actual amount of traffic on the roads and also the behaviour of drivers as well. And we've had quite a lot of press recently in New Zealand about various accidents and conflicts between motorists and cyclists, and a lot of heat going there, getting generated, I guess, from that. So there is a lot of perception of that going around at the moment. Ooh, maybe cycling isn't so safe. Okay. There was other major ones that came up was practical things, showering and changing facilities. If they felt it was a long enough distance, they really felt they had to do those things. And there's still a lot of employers who aren't providing those kinds of options for them, so it makes it a bit hard. We don't have any general bike stations, for example, which we have been talking about. But so a lot of people, they didn't really feel they had a choice at their employer to be able to provide for some of these things. And the choice of mode was often related to enjoyment of the journey, and it was interesting, for example, a lot of people associated cycling still with stress, and I guess this relates a bit to the safety one. They felt it more stressful than their current alternatives, especially those who were walking. If they were currently walking, they felt that was good. They could just sort of let their mind relax, and they felt that was enjoyable compared to what they saw as potentially a stressful situation biking. Now, I know plenty of cyclists who feel the other way, that when they bike, they feel like it de-stresses them. So it's an interesting one, though. There is quite a proportion at the moment who, at least with the existing infrastructure, feel that it's a bit too stressful. It doesn't make it an enjoyable way to get to work. Okay. A whole list of other minor barriers, and if you've been into this research, most of these you would have seen crop up as well. We heard the same things in the discussion coming through with reasonable regularity, whether it was practical things about how am I going to take all my luggage. Also people who had work vehicles, and so they were kind of demotivated to ride because, hey, someone's just given me a work car, so you know, I've got a way to get to work. In New Zealand, helmets are mandatory for everyone, and that's a little bit of a turn-off for some people. And it's interesting the need to have to wear special equipment as well. I think a lot of people said, you know, I'd want to wear my day glow jacket and have all the lights and reflectors to really feel that I was comfortable riding out there. So it is a challenge getting into that normalisation, I guess, of cycling if you feel you've got to wear all this extra equipment like that. Okay, and all the other usual things there. If I've got to take children to school, not so sure if I had to ride home at night. I guess particularly for women there was security concerns coming up, and just general confidence. If they haven't ridden for a while or not in traffic for a while, could they actually do it? Okay, some other key things. When we looked at the infrastructure, so out of the discussion from the infrastructure, and I'll show some results from that in a minute, one of the things that came through was just having a measure of consistency across all the different facilities. I guess we showed them a wide variety of things. What do you think of this? What do you think of this? And some of them felt like, you know, just pick one. Stop providing this at one street and then providing this at another street. It's just so confusing. I come up, I don't know what to do at the next type of location. So they did want some kind of consistency along across the city, or at least along a route, I guess, of similar types of facilities. And providing that continuity, so if you do it at that intersection, do it at the next intersection and the next intersection. And also providing more information on how these things work, both for the cyclists but also for the other road users as well, motorists, pedestrians, so everyone knows their space and how it's supposed to work and how the interactions are supposed to work, whether it's signs and markings on the site or public education. There was just a feeling there wasn't a lot of that around. You sort of turned up at a new site and it was like, oh, hello, how does this work? And there was no real guidance to work it out. When we asked them whether, if there was a route that was more attractive but maybe goes a bit longer, was it an issue for them? Most people were quite happy to take that little bit of extra time if they felt it was a lot better. And this mirrors some of the findings that Jennifer Dill has done here, looking at the research around Portland. People would go a little bit out of their way to pick a route that they felt was a bit more comfortable. So even for what are essentially utility trips that we were looking at, to work, to school and so forth, people were willing to do that. Okay, so there is up to a limit obviously, but you can actually look for slightly out of the way alternatives if you need to. We tried to probe the issue of traffic speed and say, well, what if we did nothing but we slowed down the traffic? Okay, would that help? And I think people just didn't get it. Okay, they just what didn't help, I suspect, is that we have some examples of traffic calming around in Christchurch which don't seem that cycle friendly. There's no bypasses, there might be some sort of pinch point, and they feel like they're forced onto the road actually at these narrow points rather than being able to escape them. So I think there was that negative feedback coming through on this issue here, that they hadn't seen enough good examples of it. And when I look at the European examples, they're always using traffic speed as a key tool. We still haven't gone that far enough down the track in New Zealand, let alone Christchurch. Our default urban speed limit is 50 k's an hour. What's that, slightly over 30 miles an hour. We have very few 40 k an hour zones. I can only think of 2 in Christchurch. No 30s I can think off the top of my head. We just haven't embraced that approach and a lot of the physical environment that goes with that as well. And so I think until we do, people won't necessarily appreciate the potential benefits of slowing that traffic or maybe even reducing that traffic as well. So it's one to work on, I suspect. Okay, I want to run through the numerical results from those ratings of the different facilities here. So we'll start off with the mid-block facilities. And what I'll show here, just to remind you, is a different type of options that we worked our way through. And you can see the ratings there from the good, the green, I would frequently use this, through to the red, I would never use this kind of facility. So firstly, no specific cycling provision. Okay, nothing there on the roads. Obviously not that favoured, not surprisingly. A conventional marked cycle lane on the roads, just a bit of paint. Okay, add a bit of extra highlighting, extra width, just a few things to jazz up that marked cycle lane. Let's put the cycle lane behind a physical curb now. So separating it from the road, I guess we're starting to get Copenhagen style here. The other way around, putting it directly behind the parking. Then adding a little bit of separation as well, so a bit of space for the car doors or the rubbish bins or whatever else gets in the way, the pedestrians. And then finally shared paths, where really you're taking the sidewalks as they are and providing a shared facility. Okay. So you can very much see a trend of increasing support with increasing separation as you go through until you get to sharing with the pedestrians again, and then it falls back from there. Okay, so perhaps what we may have suspected, it's certainly getting reflected in these ratings here. Interesting though, if you look at if you consider the top two, the green and the yellow, as being pretty good ratings, most of them give you fairly good ratings. Even the humble cycle lane has a reasonable amount of support there from people who'd say, yeah, I'd definitely use it, or I'd sometimes use it. They're not so bad as well. Okay, so we sometimes get a bit of disparagement about cycle lanes. They still do have their place and their role, certainly I guess where the alternatives are a bit too hard or a bit too costly. And it's interesting, we often hear people say you shouldn't have on-road cycle lanes, put them on the pathway instead. And in New Zealand that usually means a shared footpath. You can see though that certainly wasn't rated any better than a cycle lane. Indeed, if you put some extra highlighting on the road, that would probably work out better than sticking them onto the sidewalk. Okay, but there's clearly a bit of interest in these other options in the middle here that we're just starting to experiment with. Okay, people like those options, and certainly when I've looked overseas at some of them, they're popular and they do seem quite promising. Okay, if we look at signalised intersections for the straight ahead manoeuvre, there was only 4 options we provided here. First one was nothing provided at the intersection itself, just a conventional cycle lane to allow you to go straight through, keeping you off the road on a cycle path, but you just go with the traffic signals, general traffic signals, and then having your own specific cycle signal where everyone else is stopped or the conflicting traffic is stopped as well. Okay, again, sort of increasing level of protection, if you like, and so that top one certainly showed up as having the most support. There was no one who really hated that at all. These ones had reasonable amounts of support, I guess, so it's providing some provision over there. Okay, for the right-hand manoeuvre, so we had a few more options presented here. Firstly, again, nothing provided at all, which is especially not much fun if you've got mixed turning lanes like that. Having at least a dedicated right turn, your left turn traffic lane that you can at least shelter in as well. Having a specific cycle lane for turning, in this situation here, having the advanced stop box, the bike box, providing that hook turn in the 2-phase manoeuvre, and having the head start facilities where you get to go ahead of the traffic. So there's the options we presented. Clearly those last two were quite favoured. Okay, people really did like these concepts of their own space or their own time, if you like, to be able to make that tricky right turn manoeuvre. One of the interesting things that came out with the head start lights, even though it was quite well favoured, was a lot of the respondents, I think, were thinking like a motorist. Okay, a lot of them did, at the moment, drive to work for much of the time. And so they were thinking about the impact on other motorists and thinking, ooh, I'm not so sure about this because this holds up the motorists a bit more. So while they liked it, they're like, maybe I'd go for the hook turn because that doesn't hold up the traffic so much. So that was kind of interesting. We saw that in a few things where the traffic speed was probably another one where they perhaps liked the concept but thought, oh, but that's going to hold up the motorists. And so this is not something you often see from die-hard cyclists, but for these converting people, they often were looking at that and thinking, how's it going to affect the other road users as well? Okay, but still, there's very strong support for those two options in particular for right turns. Finally, for roundabouts, the options provided here, nothing provided at all, although hopefully the geometry should slow people down anyway. Some kind of cycle lane, which most guidebooks tell you actually don't do, but we threw it in there anyway. A directional cycle lanes, the York-style spiralling off ones. Now off-road, so pathways where you actually have to give way to the traffic at each of the crossing points. And then the opposite, where they have to give way to you as you go around. And then finally, underpasses of some configuration to just avoid the traffic completely. And again, that showed up particularly strongly as underpasses, much stronger than the others. And even though the paths were not too bad, and even the York one wasn't too bad as well, in general, there certainly wasn't as much level of support, and I think it just reflected the fact that people didn't like roundabouts. And while this was focused on single lane, I think their opinions were still coloured a lot by a lot of the grotty multi-lane roundabouts that we do have in New Zealand, so I suspect that was coming through. Okay, so some sort of summarising of that, there did seem a preference for more off-roadway types of routes. Okay, getting off the road carriageway, I mean, completely away from the road corridor is great, but within the road corridor, at least having some kind of separation by a path or a curb or something like that. If not, then they actually were okay with cycle lanes, particularly if they were highlighted really well. Good use of colour, good use of separation, wide lines and things like that. Still held its own. It wasn't a bad option there. Okay, so there was some kind of level of separation really wanted either way. Okay, just as much as they didn't want to mix with the motorists, they also didn't really want to mix with the pedestrians as well. So actually having separate cycle-only facilities, well, there definitely was a preference there. If there was a slight preference, it was to pedestrians, especially if there was no kind of facilities at all provided on the road. But as I say, it wasn't as strong as you might have expected. And definitely coming through in the discussion, and part of the reason why they didn't like some of these options, especially the on-road ones, was they didn't feel that motorists would respect that space. You know, you paint something on the road, yeah, but the cars still go and park themselves on top of it, drive over it. So the minute you introduce some kind of physical element to it, I think they were more comforted by the fact that cars couldn't physically or couldn't easily do that kind of mixture. Okay, so just wrapping up some conclusions and I guess really some recommendations for what we want to start to take forward from here. So we were focusing on non-cyclists or infrequent cyclists, people who might cycle, say, recreationally, but weren't really cycling for a utility purpose. Okay, but were interested in potentially that option. There was a desire for more cycling. Okay, these people were very sympathetic. They had bikes, they sometimes used the bikes. They would like more opportunities to be able to use it. They could see the advantages from a whole range of reasons there. Okay, but they wanted a bit more of a motivation, a good reason to do that. And safety was the biggest barrier to them, or perceived safety at least, in terms of why they didn't bike. Okay, and that was related very much to the traffic and both its volume and its behaviour as well, the motor traffic there. So definitely some preference for segregated infrastructure. And I guess this is sort of reflecting what we've seen in the experiences from Europe, where they've done a lot of that investment in separated facilities, and I guess they've reaped the rewards in terms of the numbers that they're getting there as well. And an overriding concern that make sure everyone understands what you're doing as well. Okay, make sure there's good public education, signs and markings, so that firstly cyclists know how to use it, but then also all other road users, car drivers, cyclists, I should add pedestrians there as well, they respect it, they know where they should be and how they should interact as well. That's got to be part of the equation as well, seems to be coming through. So we need to, in Christchurch, I think, start to be a bit brave, I guess, and try a few more of these different types of options that have showed some promise in the ratings. Roll out a bit more, and certainly if we're serious about trying to get more cycling, getting that next 10% or whatever of cyclists, spending a bit of money, I guess, to make some of them happen, because some of them aren't cheap, admittedly. Okay. All right, so I'll wrap up there and take any questions. And just once again, I'd really like to thank the people here at Portland State for hosting me the last few weeks. It's been a great experience to look around this city, learn a few more things to take home as well. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Glenn. If you have questions, if you could please press the little microphone box down there and speak into it, because this is being recorded, so we'll make sure to capture the questions as well as the response.
I was struck by the response to what we call it green boxes, but you were showing the different options.
Yep.
And the one that I guess we would call a green box, that you showed it in red, wasn't terribly highly favored. It had some of the never response to it. Is it possible they just didn't understand how to use it? Was confusion about that? Would that have been an element of the response?
I think so for those, and there was some research done a few years ago in Christchurch when they were first introduced. We've had some of those for about 8 or 10 years. Not all with colour though. Traditionally they were just a box, and we've more recently put colour in. And for providing storage space for that go-ahead manoeuvre, people were pretty comfortable about that. A lot of them were still very concerned about its ability to help you with that right turn manoeuvre. And I guess the trick is always, what happens when the light's already going? How do I get over there? And you know, the short answer is it's not easy at the moment. Where we have found it useful is in locations where you have a mixed traffic lane. So if you've got say a straight and a right turning lane, and you're not sure where the motorist might go, having the ability to get the bike in front of them stops that potential cut-off kind of crash. And so that's where I found it to be most value. But yeah, I think there is still some uncertainty about, it comes back to that question, will the motorists respect this and understand that? Will they stay out of it for a start, and will they let me have my space? And we're still working on that.
I'm Craig Grace with Bureau of Transportation. I'm curious, the roads you looked at look like they're all arterial collector type streets. When you were doing your survey with the community, were you testing at all lower volume, lower stress environments, or was this, I guess, tell us a little bit more about the streets that you're actually trying to figure out facilities for when you're looking at it from the way you are?
Yep, you're correct. We were probably focusing on that sort of collector / minor arterial type of road, which for a lot of people they're going to have to encounter some part of that on their trip. We kind of have a mix of some grid network and some sort of more modern loops and lollipops type of layouts, and it's fairly hard in a number of places to find those alternative quiet street routes. So we did focus on, if there is some amount of traffic, and our pictures tried to represent that as well, there's a bit of traffic going past every 10 seconds or so, there's something going past. Just because otherwise, if we didn't do that, we were forced to only, I guess, consider low street options. And we know practically that's not going to work for a lot of the network there. I guess we tried to introduce that question into the whole thing about traffic calming. If we took away the speeds and the volumes a bit, would that help? And as I said, because we don't have a lot of examples of that, we haven't done bike boulevards, for example. And I really want to take that idea back to Christchurch and say, hey, there's a few locations I can think of where this could work really well. Yeah, I think people still don't get that ability. It's interesting. If we go back 2 decades, the original Christchurch bike plan focused on a lot of back street routes. Sort of had, we wiggle through here and go through here, and it had all these routes that they were going to work on. When they reviewed that about a decade later and worked out where the cyclists were, they were all on the main roads. Even though there was no facilities there, people said, this is the quick way to get from A to B. I don't get stopped, it's a straight line. And so the focus changed, and they said, okay, well, let's put some cycle lanes on some of these main roads. Okay, I suspect the short answer is we need to now start working on both. That there's a market who wants that directness, but there's another market, as I say, who are quite willing to go a little bit out of their way, and we have to get back into that as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Great presentation. Okay, there we go. Thank you. I just have a quick question about the cycle track examples that you showed. I noticed that in most of the photos there are a number of driveways. And is that common on most of the arterial streets, and have you had issues related to driveways crossing those types of facilities?
It is very common in New Zealand. We don't tend to do, say, like service alleyways and back lots. It's very much you front straight out onto the main roads. So it was a concern, and I know some of the technical people in Christchurch have been concerned about, as you get to some of these Copenhagen-style things, you're going to have all these driveways. Surely we're going to have all these conflicts and problems. It hasn't proved to be a problem with the two trial ones that we've done, this one here and the earlier Tennyson Street one. You saw, though, we used a lot of colour, we used a lot of markings to really highlight it there. And I was very comforted when I was in Copenhagen last month as well, where you have this situation coming up a lot. And again, it didn't seem to be a real problem. And I guess particularly if you make it hard for cars to drive across them quickly. I was a lot more comforted having seen it in operation in Copenhagen. I thought we can actually take these back and they will work. But you want to try and get the basics like speed and sight lines as much as you can sorted out. And we have to in New Zealand because it is like that. Okay.
Yeah, to build on that one, I was really interested that the separated cycle track behind the parking in your mid-block slide was the most favored one for frequent cyclists was that option there. So not only with the number of driveways on a arterial or collector street, but what about unsignalized intersections? Just a stop sign sort of a situation. Did you analyze that at all, and how would that be resolved from a safety standpoint?
Yeah, I guess the purpose of making sure in our photos we had the side roads in the photo was that hopefully people were thinking about that implication, and it came up a little bit in discussion, and I guess some were concerned about how it might work, and some just felt, hey, I'm safer the rest of the time. I'm not too concerned about how I work across. Now, in practice, they might find the realities a bit harder, but as I say, this is stated preference. We've got to test these things out. The Tennyson Street one that I showed you before is an interesting example. We don't have a default crosswalk law in New Zealand. Okay, unless you're in the roadway itself, you do not have priority walking along a pathway or biking along a pathway, even across the side road traffic. And that was a legal sticking point. If we had these cycleways on the pathway, then they got to the side roads, well, they had to stop technically for the side road traffic. The solution to that in that particular case was taking them back onto the road ahead of the side road, then you had priority, then you put it back onto the pathway. So that was our legal fix to get around that. It's not entirely ideal though, and it'd be nice to change the law. It might be though that you do the same with that type of situation, at least in our current legislative environment, is that you have that separation, but you get to the roads, you do actually just bring them out for a short bit, so legally they do have the priority over the side roads, and a bit more visibility potentially as well. They're a bit more out there rather than feeling like they're popping out from behind the cars.
Rob, did you have a question back there?
Yep.
I had a question about your question slide here. You're showing a two-way cycle track in this photo, right?
Yes.
And you talked about your Copenhagen experience where pretty much all their cycle tracks are directional. Are you experimenting with the two-way, or do you have a preference with directional versus two-way yet?
As I mentioned, this one is a bit of a special case that at one end you've got a signalised crossing that gets you to a high school and university. At the other end it feeds directly onto the railway cycleway. So there was not really an issue in this one of, and it's a quiet street anyway, of traffic having to cross over the road and then coming back. But we do seem to have that habit in New Zealand of skimping, I'd say. Let's just build it on one side. In fact, I've been monitoring online, we're debating one in Christchurch at the moment. They're building this pathway on one side of a busy state highway, and some of the people are saying, well, I wouldn't bike to that, I'd just stay on the on-road cycle lanes. They're still there. I'm not going to hop over here and use this pathway to then hop back over like that. So I think we'll end up with a bit of a mix of these facilities, partly for economics, but partly people will start to realise that, yeah, as you say, Copenhagen, Netherlands as well, invariably they were pretty much both sides. They give you the provision, and if the demand's strong enough, you need to do that. It's just not helping otherwise. Yep.
I'm Debbie Ames. I work with an urban design consultant in Portland that we're real proponents of cycle tracks, so this is a great presentation. But I wanted to ask if you take if you took connecting key destinations into your, analysis on cycle tracks, like connecting neighborhoods to shopping centers, or was it just commuting to work, or was it just bicycling in general?
We, the initial 2 sets of surveys for the university and the recreational cyclists, we did largely focus on the trip to work or the trip to school, to university. But the community cycle group was trying to get a bit more of that broader mix, and in fact it was requested by our client. We hadn't had it in the original proposal, and they said, we want you to try and explore the community area a bit more as well. As I said, it was a bit harder to actually get a market for that, an audience for people considering that, but we did pose to them, okay, how often or would you bike to the shops, to the library, to the sports ground, to a restaurant? We tried to throw all the kind of potential utility scenarios in there, and we had some of those people in the focus groups as well, and we did try and present this as any kind of utility trip. While most people will be thinking of work or school, this could be for any A to B trip. That was about it. Okay.
Yes, I'm Rachel Furtashewski from the state's Transportation and Growth Management Program, and I actually had a question. When you said that traffic speed was not an issue on one of your slides, and then you were sort of talking about traffic calming measures, and you mentioned specifically what are like the bulb outs that
Yes.
extend from the edges of the curbs. I was wondering, is it really that traffic speed is not an issue, or is it more that you were saying people had a reluctance to make traffic changes that would impede traffic, so maybe they would be more amenable to different kinds of traffic calming or on side streets?
There was an element of both there, and as I said, they were thinking a little bit, I think, for their fellow motorists, if you like, about these are going to inconvenience them. I guess we haven't done enough selling of the other potential benefits of traffic management, traffic calming, for people to say, perhaps those problems are outweighed by the significant benefits, and we need to work a bit more on that. I personally felt we haven't done enough in Christchurch on this, so we were trying to get the reaction, and I think the reaction we got was, because we haven't done enough of this, people didn't get it. And I guess until you've seen some of the nice environments, say some of the European examples, where you just feel like you can't go fast, and you feel like there are certain roads you shouldn't use, people perhaps don't appreciate the possibilities of that.
I guess I was just sort of wondering if maybe they didn't understand the connection between their perceived safety and the speed of the cars, because most of the research that I've looked at says that traffic speed is a really big issue for cyclists. They feel very unsafe when traffic goes above a certain point.
I think they didn't feel this was a solution, because while most evidence suggests, whether it's bumps or narrowings or whatever, this slows down traffic, at the same time, a number of them were narrow points, and they felt like, well, you might have slowed down the traffic a few miles an hour, but I'm now with that traffic. It's not slow enough yet. So I guess until you get to it, feels like they're doing the same speed as me. And we haven't done a lot of what I call strong traffic calming that really gets to that kind of level. Maybe they're doing 40 k's an hour, they're not doing 30 k's an hour in these environments. And at that point, they might start to feel that this is actually okay, I can share the street.
Well, he'll be around for a couple minutes here, but again, thank you very much for sharing your research and your expertise with us today. And thank you all for coming, and we'll be resuming the regular series here at the end of September when the term starts. So thanks very much.
Good.